So improvising was a big part of the curriculum at UCC. It was one of the few things that we did for the whole year. Like we had one course, but we did it both semesters. And there's so many different approaches to improvisation in general, right? And every genre in a way has its tradition of improvisation, including classical music, right? Like there's such a healthy tradition, or there
Right.
was such a healthy tradition of improvisation. Perhaps what many people think of now is more of a like free jazz or jazz adjacent improv. This was a real like gesture, texture, what is this sound, like sort of American experimentalism approach to improvisation. It was almost more like creating like live and not ambient music, because ambient music is its own thing, but live sort of spatialized soundscapey texture musical events. And I mean, there were a lot of things that came of this. One of my challenges was that when we first started, like we would go to class and basically get set up and start improvising. And one of my first challenges was like I realized I was improvising in a way that was like I was composing.
Mm.
And my cohort was there was a jazz trumpet player, there was a filmmaker who also played drums and bass for like death metal bands, and
Oh,
there was
yeah.
a theater sound designer. That was my cohort. And so I would do something, and obviously none of them would do anything remotely close to what
Yeah.
a composition might do with that material. And so I very quickly had to divorce myself from the idea that this is how material can or should be developed. The other thing that was amazing at Cork was that, I guess I misspoke a little bit earlier in that I had encountered improvisation before, but often when I had encountered it, like at a summer festival, the person facilitating the workshop often retreated back into that, like, it's hard to teach improvisation. Like,
Yeah.
and that, like, I call bullshit on that actually, because the the professors at Cork taught us improvisation. Like we did exercises about how to expand your listening and how to be
Mm.
more aware or how to be more responsive. And they were designed like in a similar way that you might do exercises to improve your technical facility on an instrument. They're really designed to improve your reactive and responsive and listening facility in the moment of improvising. And perhaps most profoundly, there was a big scene of experimental music and experimental art in general, just like fringe art stuff in Cork. And I remember going to an improv set in my first months there and just thinking like this is like some of the best music I've ever heard in my life. Like this is so engaging and so interesting. Why do I have a hold up about the fact that like it's not working in the same way as the music I've been trained to make is?
Yeah.
And so that was a really profound moment of like just expanding what could be possible. The other thing that came up for me in studying improv like this and doing improv was that as I increasingly did vocal improv, I realized that the way that you can navigate into different sounds or different textures or different relationships is very felt. It's less strategic than what we might think of vocalization as like being really like locked in with harmony, or listening to sort of jazz vocalists who can freely modulate through
Right.
7 keys, and I cannot do that, and it's extraordinary. But in the improv we were doing, I was like, it's actually more productive for me to just feel and explore what's happening in my body, register the sonic output, and then use that as material. So not only did that become a really like cogent philosophy in my improvising, but it became a huge part of my composition. Like I started going back to the music I was writing and realizing, if I'm approaching improv this way, I bet of course, like every musician, every performer must be approaching their instrument in a similar way. Like there must be
Mm.
some sort of felt interstice of like, and usually it's what you're trying to avoid in many classical music styles, but there are these spaces that you can actually navigate to through your body, and that produce all sorts of fascinating
Yeah.
results. And so the improvising wound up affecting my music in such a way that I started trying to write pieces and make scores that were trying to get performers into that space. And then once they were there, let them cultivate the things they might find there rather than being really didactic about timing
Yeah.
or like, when should you move from sol tasto to sol
Right.
ponticello.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that actually, how this manifests in your composed work, because you have a number of scores that feature various degrees of non-traditional elements like graphic notation or text-based instructions. I'm thinking of pieces like your dredge pieces, and there's another one for percussion that you have that's just a beautiful score.
Oh, thank you.
It's called, please correct me if I'm saying this wrong, Anthropony.
Yeah, anthrophony.
Anthropony. So I'm guessing now that these practices were kind of born out of your time in Cork as well. How do you approach this from a composer's standpoint in your scores, and what has the response been like from performers?
Yeah.
Are they keen to kind of journey with you into this space?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I mean, in some ways it started from a practical standpoint. Like while I was in Cork, I was writing a piece for a trio called Trompo. They're based in the Netherlands. And I had started by actually recording an improvisation, and I was sort of doing a light transcription to make this piece. And it was like really overly notated, like lots of like time changes and specificity there. And they basically said, "Look, we're spending so much time trying to coordinate this that we're not actually playing your music." And so being in the program, I was like, "Okay, what is a better way to achieve this?" And that's where I started sort of moving away from a typical score and moving into like, how can I still use notation to communicate to people who are from the tradition of notation, but encourage them to either be a little bit more free or kind of help remove some of the rehearsal barriers that come up with complicated new music so that they can get to the sounds faster.
Mm,
And then once I did that, and that one wound up looking like a kind of typical duration based score. But then I wrote Anthrophony after that, and the idea there was, okay, well, why can't I take it further? Like, what if I'm going after a gesture or a texture that's really not super grounded in like specific metrical time, why do I need to use time at all?
yeah, right.
Um, and I think something that I encountered through studying improvisation is obviously there's this incredible tradition of graphic scores, but I wanted to have something that was a little bit more repeatable than a graphic score, because you could give a graphic score to 7 different people from 7 different traditions, and you're going to get 7 different,
Right.
completely different like results. And I had this sense of, I like this idea of freedom, but I still want to be clear in the kind of sound world I'm cultivating. And that's kind of been the main motivator for the pieces like Anthrophony and like the dredge pieces. Like the dredge pieces, what I'm doing there, and if you're curious, they're on my website and you can see them, is there's actually a lot of very specific notation, but it is arranged in such a way that it's like, I'm using this notation because I know, as someone in contemporary classical music, you will look at this and know the sounds I'm asking about.
Mm,
Like if I put in a bunch of nested tuplets and half harmonic fingering and whatever, like you have an idea of what that means. But I don't care if you actually play what I wrote. I want you to play that sound world.
mm,
And once you're in that sound world, I want you to explore it. So I think with purely graphic notation, you run the risk of basically like losing a little bit of, how would I even say it? I guess like depending on your comfort level, it can be really close to what you imagined or it can be super far away. And I wanted to still encourage a sense of freedom and exploration, but for performers who maybe have not done improvisation before and still within a particular sonic environment that I'm
Mm.
interested in.
Yeah, I think going through this path, of composition myself and encountering all kinds of different people and opinions and aesthetics, I feel like there's always this kind of underlying assumption from certain schools of thought that, graphic notation is almost like a cop out for composers,
Right,
And I love what you're saying about taking the graphic notation to a different level where your voice is still there.
right,
It's not just like here's a picture, make stuff up.
right.
Like you still have this very thought out process behind it. You have these results that you're looking for, but like you said, the freedom. I really love that.
You know, the other thing that my scores look like is sort of Ludoslavsky aleatory, and that's another thing that I don't like because I think aleatory has become, sorry, let me rephrase that. I like aleatory. I don't always love how it's implemented in
Yeah.
contemporary music. And not because I don't think it's well thought out, but because I think it becomes very rote. Like it can become rote for the performer and it can, to my hearing, distance the performer from what's going on in the performance because they're just locked into doing something repeatedly rather than really thinking about, okay, what is the space that's being created? What is the timing of it? What's the gesture? So, something I write in my scores is like, do not play what I have written. Figure out what sound world this is and locate yourself in it.
You gave an example with this trio of how you were first writing this kind of music and it was extremely notated, to almost it sounded like to a fault where,
Yeah,
they were like, this is so complicated, we're not able to make music out of this. We're not
right.
able to make art out of this. What has been the response from performers now that you have opened things up, made things more free for them?
It varies. It definitely requires some communication, right? Because there's still this expectation of, are we executing what you're putting on the page, quote unquote, correctly?
Yeah.
And I think just what correctly means shifts in this context. So the percussion piece I actually wrote as a commission for Western Carolina University's percussion studio, which Adam Groh
Mm.
runs slash ran. I think
Yeah.
he's moving to Cincinnati.
Yeah, we're excited.
Yeah.
We love Adam. So,
Um,
yeah.
but so that has actually become one of my most performed pieces because I've gotten it into the hands of a few university percussion instructors. And the instructors love it because it is a nice way to introduce things like improvisation or more free form scores without being just a totally open graphic score.
Yeah.
But I've also been lucky enough to work with a lot of the student ensembles who have done it. And I think that has been extremely rewarding for myself certainly, but also based on feedback for the students because I think with my slightly more strategic approach to improvisation, I'm able to ask them to do things or to come up with exercises about how to pull apart the score a bit that really opens their ears to the ways that they can engage with what
Mm.
I'm giving. So where I have a rehearsal tonight for the premiere of Dredge 1, and it'll be interesting to see how this works because this one, I wrote it for the group that I'm a part of in New Orleans called Versapel, but I also wrote it so that free improvisers who like I play with in gigs around the city can just sit in and add.
Mm.
So there's no part for them. They're kind of supplementing and augmenting as though it's an actual live free improv. And I'm really excited about this because I think that this is sort of the pinnacle is like, how can I create something that still lets people explore and not just explore in general, but one of the things that happens is in free improv is like suddenly material will stick out and I'm
Mhm.
like, "Oh, I have to pursue that. I That was not the plan, but here we are and
Yeah.
now I have to go this way." And that even in the realm of like open notation that I'm using, that is still a challenge. Like how do you let someone really find a path and follow it? And I'm hoping that this piece gets closer to that. I think one thing that I haven't actually heard this from a performer, but something I've been thinking about is complexity and how
Mm.
with with contemporary classical music, we tend to think of complexity in terms of like microtonality or like heavy rhythmic
You're
notation,
right.
like of the like Fernie Ho-esque complexity. And I think one of the misperceptions about that type of complexity is that it is totally restrictive. I think Fernie Ho himself, like he's writing those things on purpose, but there's also a lot of philosophy behind like pushing performers into a space where they have to make a negotiation
Yeah.
and what comes out of that. And so in my scores, I'm thinking of complexity less in terms of notation and more in terms of character and like what are the things that I can put in the score that allow the performer to continually uncover new ideas and new sounds. And sometimes that's notation, sometimes it's graphics, oftentimes it's text and like being very purposeful about the way that I write instructions in the score and the way that I load the score with text. It's not there because I'm trying to be overly controlling of technique. It's there as another way that the performer can look at the score and dig into what the score means. And I hope that that is what something like this pulls up. Now, obviously, the challenge with this is that if you're working with folks who are trained in contemporary classical music, they're trained to be very good at
Mm.
getting to a score, figuring out what to do, and getting out quickly. And it just requires a different type of engagement. And I don't always know if that is clear. But I've been really lucky to basically work closely with the people performing these so I can explain it to some degree.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Micromaker by Loose Leaf Transmissions. We hope you enjoyed this brief glimpse into the inner workings of the creative life. If this resonated with you, be sure to check out the full conversation on Music Maker with Tyler Kline, a podcast exploring craft and process, philosophy and inspiration, and the honest, often messy parts of being an artist, creative uncertainty, purpose and identity, and resilience. You can find Music Maker wherever you get your podcasts or by visiting musicmakerpodcast.com.